an evaluation at the end of this that I will send in the chat. You could also find the link at the Padlet location as well. And I just want to thank Jennifer Hall for being so gracious to present today.
Thank you, Megan. I'm so excited to be here. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Targeting Writing Supports for MLLs and ELLs. My name is Jennifer Hall, and I'm the Multilingual Learner and English Language Learner Specialist at the Collaborative for Inclusive Education here in New York. And just so happy to be with you all here at the Long Island Teacher Institute, remotely, virtually. This is the world we live in. Move on here. Just some quick webinar logistics on my end. I did drop a Padlet link, so I'm obsessed with Padlet if you don't already know about it. I love it just really to curate resources for folks. I've curated resources for you all. A lot of the session things that I share throughout the slide decks are attached to the Padlet, but I also added some other items that will kind of allow you to do more of a deep dive into the topic session today. So that is yours, as long as Padlet lives on and the interwebs, it is yours to access whenever. And then also I always encourage folks to interact as we're trying to be more fun on social media, my organization. So our handle is at Inclusive Ed New York. We're on Twitter, Instagram. And then I always encourage a lively chat, respond to me, ask questions. I'll try to keep lookout at the chat. I'm sometimes bad at that. So maybe Megan can interrupt me if there's like a pressing question. I don't mind interruptions, Megan. And then also comment on each other's comments. This is 45 minutes, which is really short for me. I typically do 60 or 90-minute sessions, so I'm not going to talk too much about myself. But real quick, I've been in ELL education for about a decade. As soon as I graduated school, my undergrad, I knew that the community that I wanted to work with was an international community, a multilingual community. And so I've worked with them in multiple capacities ever since. I've been a classroom teacher. I've worked at a dual language school in Guatemala. And then prior to joining the collaborative here in New York City, I served as ELL coordinator at a charter school in Phoenix that was 60% ELL. And then of course I added cat mom. I love my 2 cats and I am a proud cat mom. All right, so just to kind of start today, I wanted to set our intention. I love doing this at the beginning of each of my sessions, and I always encourage this type of practice for you as instructors to do with your students as well. Just gets us grounded into the next 45 minutes with each other. So one, I just want you all to consider, to whom are you dedicating this learning to today and why? So you'll type your response into the chat, but don't press submit yet. I want you to press submit when I say our code word for today, which is empower. And I chose that word because I just really want to empower you all today with tools for writing instruction for our multilingual learner students. I also added some sentence stems for you all, if you'd like to use those as well. So go ahead and type your response in the chat. Who are you dedicating your learning to? I'll set our clock for 30 seconds. All right, empower. I love seeing, so what I love about this practice too is you get to see everyone respond at the same time. Oh, I love these dedications. All ELLs, love it, Dina. Dedicate today's learning. Love reading these. Yeah, and what's really great about having a code word practice too for our English language learners is it really allows for that think time, right? When we're in this remote space and you're posing a question to your students, having that code word practice, again, allows for that think time, that process time. Also, it's a really good check for understanding too. Instead of students that maybe are English proficient, they're answering before our L's, they're giving that answer away. So we don't truly know if our students are copying or not. So again, allows for processing time, think time, and that check for understanding. Here we go. All right. So real quick, again, 45 minutes is not a long time in this space, and I have a lot to share with you today. So in terms of agenda, I'm going to spend most of my time in sentence level supports, right? Because when we get into paragraph writing, that's really just an expansion, right, of sentence level. So if students can master that sentence level supports, moving into that paragraph writing is going to be much more easy for them. So I am going to spend most of my time in that sentence level, but I will be speaking to paragraph level supports as well. And then I just wanted to name that up also up front is I recognize that you all are in this field. I say in the remote space, you are truly the experts. I can talk all day about, remote considerations, but you all are in the classroom, in the field, doing the thing. So I just want to name that I really feel that you are the experts in this space. And then also, some of you probably are using some of the strategies that I share. So please share in the chat if you're using a strategy. How are you using that to share with your peers? All right. Just some suggested text real quick. I put these in the Padlet as well. I pulled some different pieces from each of these texts for today's session. I love all three of these books. The Writing Revolution isn't necessarily English language learner facing, but it has amazing tools and suggestions for writing supports for any student that struggles with writing. And then the other two are very English language learner specific. All right. So let's get into it. Writing considerations for multilingual learners. So just some things to consider when you are lesson planning and thinking about how can I support my L's in writing instruction. First, differentiating between content knowledge and writing proficiency. Our L's are coming to us with content knowledge, especially if they're coming to you as newcomers or entering students in the upper elementary, middle school, high school levels. They probably have a lot of content knowledge in that L1 language. It's the struggle that they're going to have is producing that language in the language of instruction, English, right? They're going to struggle with those idioms. They're going to struggle with sentence structure, vocabulary. Also, providing our multilinguals with opportunities to explain their writing. Super important here. We want them to explain why they made the choices they made when they're writing. And this really allows you to hear, okay, this is where I need to target the support. They made this choice because they have this misunderstanding. When they have that opportunity to explain that to you, you can really then target supports in writing. Also, providing a variety of opportunities to interact with content. I am sure you've heard of this acronym, SWIRL. That's our 4 domains of language: speaking, listening, reading, and writing. We want to provide those at-bats for students before we ask them to produce language through writing. We want them to speak about the content, listen to their peers talk about content, listen to you talk about the content and that key vocabulary. We want them to read about the content and then go into that writing piece. Write interactively with your students through shared writing. When you share those strategies and you're talking through those strategies, it's a great way to really bulk up those strategies for them to be able to independently move on to producing their own writing pieces. Also provide visual context for writing, have anchor charts that reference those strategies that you work on together with. Those graphic organizers may be on an anchor chart as well that they're working through. Any type of visual context is going to make that content more concrete for them, but also maybe jog that prior knowledge as well. And then finally, receptive versus productive tasks. This is really, really important in writing instruction. We always want to begin with receptive tasks because students aren't producing language yet in receptive tasks. That linguistic load is really light, right? They're just working through content. And then we want them to go into producing that writing, those productive tasks. And I'm going to go into more detail on that in just a bit. But now I just want you to take a moment to look over this slide and these writing considerations, because on the next slide, I'm going to ask you all to reflect on these considerations. Okay, so in the chat, which of those considerations are you intrigued by and why? So type your answer into the chat, but don't press send yet until I say our code word empower. So I'll give you 30 seconds to think about those considerations. Okay, I don't think we need the full time for that. Empower. Shared writing. Seeing a mixture. I have some folks really interested in that shared writing piece, receptive versus productive tasks. Kind of half and half. Great. Right, I'm excited to explain more the difference between receptive and productive and the really importance of that in writing instruction. There we go. All right, so what's the difference? So we want to start with receptive tasks because it really involves more of that reading and listening domain. Students aren't required to produce language at this point. It's very passive learning. They're getting those backs with the content, and it's all about that input they're receiving. Whereas a productive task typically involves the production of language. That's that speaking and writing domain. Students are actively learning, they're writing about the content, they're orally speaking about the content, so they're producing language at this point based on all of those at-bats that you provided for them during the receptive time. And this is really, the productive tasks are really going to involve that prior knowledge that they acquired when you were teaching the lesson, when you were working on the objective and providing and swirling through that content. All right, so sentence level writing, here we are. So what is it? Well, it's grammar, right? It's our parts of speech, it's our sentence structure, and our L's are really going to struggle from going from that simple sentence structure to that more complex structure. I'm sure many of you all have asked your students, especially your English language learners, tell me more, can you add more detail? And they look at you with those doe eyes and they're just like, I don't have that vocabulary. So really thinking about how can we lighten that linguistic load so that they can begin to work with those complex sentence structures. So how do we approach those language confusions? So first, we really want to model how to break a sentence down into those manageable chunks. All right. And once we teach them those tools and those strategies to be able to break a sentence down after we've modeled, then students, we really want them to be able to do that on their own. So when they are writing or they're reading a sentence and they're having a struggle with it, you've already provided them with those strategies. So independence is key. That independence release model is key. We want students to be able to do that on their own. And then, of course, use complex sentence structures with students when you're providing those at-bats with those receptive activities. We want them to be exposed to those complex structures so that when they are given that opportunity to work with those structures on their own and they're breaking them down, they've seen those types of structures before. So don't be afraid of the rigor with our English language learners. And I'm going to give you examples of how to do that. All right, but of course, you know, as New York teachers, we have this daunting task of students taking the NICE flat. And of course, the overall goal is that they demonstrate proficiency on NICE flat. So I just wanted to bring that up because this is something that is really important for our students. And specifically in the writing space, you're going to see sentence level and the complexity of language and the coherence of response space. And really in these spaces, students are required in order to demonstrate at the commanding level to use a variety of sentence structures. So they're using simple sentences, they're using expanded sentences, and they're using compound sentences. They're using the conjunctions, they're adding the extra clauses in order to demonstrate proficiency. So I really encourage you all to, if you're not using this, you know, during your lesson planning time, look at this, take a look what's required of our English language learners to demonstrate proficiency. All right, so enough of me talking. I want to share a video strategy. This is going to be, I believe it's a 4th grade classroom. I am sure that some of you are already using this strategy, but I really think it's a great way to be able to lighten that linguistic load for our students. And we're asking them to respond, you know, in social studies, in science, to a question. How are they able to actually respond using a complex sentence structure while we lighten that linguistic load? And this is a great strategy to do that with sentence frames. So I'm actually going to leave my screen here and we're going to go to the teaching channel. There we are. All right, and as we watch this video, I just want you all to think about, you know, how can I translate this strategy into my classroom? Where is it in the ELA block? Is it in my social studies block? Is it in my science block? If you're already using it, please share with your peers what you're doing to use sentence stems or sentence frames in your classroom. So let's go ahead and watch the video.
What is the author's viewpoint about exploring?
A sentence frame is a strategy that I use, especially for my English language learners, to give them an opportunity to answer a question. It's basically the setup of a sentence with a piece missing from it so that they can fill in the information. I've taken part of the job of writing away from the student so they can focus on the content.
If you were going to fill in this sentence, how would you fill it in? The author thinks exploring is...
I think it's exciting because you could find out new stuff about different things you never knew about.
Okay.
I write the sentence frames on sentence strips to help provide the students with the language that I'd like to hear them using when they're talking about the answer and writing about the answer.
How does the author feel about Lewis and Clark? And in order to answer this question, you're going to have to prove it to me.
I think the author feels like that Lewis and Clark are very strong because they have to go through all these dangers and hazards. And then
the sentence frame especially help my English language learners because it gives them a structure for answering the questions. It helps all of my students be successful.
I think that Lewis and Clark were very brave because it says that Lewis considered the Mandan Indian stories about huge bears to be fanciful tales until one of the explorers was chased by a grizzly bear.
Do you think you would have enough proof to be able to say that the author feels that Lewis and Clark is brave?
The sentence frames help my students to understand what an answer might look like. For most of my students, I let them know that it's optional, but it gives students an option for starting so they're not staring at the paper, not knowing where to begin.
All right, share my screen again. Okay, so video reaction. So how can the sentence frame strategy translate to your classroom time? So type your ideas into the chat, but don't press send yet until I say our code word. And if you're already using it and you're, please share your ideas. I know some of you are veteran teachers. Share with your peers what you're doing to facilitate complex writing for our multilingual learners. I'll give you 30 seconds. My timer stopped. Empower. All right, let's see what we got. Yes, it helps students focus on the content, not question on hand, rather than expressing themselves. Yes, I love sentence frames because, again, it lightens up linguistic load. Our multilingual learners are having to think twice as much, right? They're thinking about translating content. They're thinking about the language. Their brains are working really hard. So if there's a way for us to allow them to just focus on the key vocabulary, that essential content, sentence frame strategy is a great way to do that. Matthew says, I use sentence frames to help my students communicate their ideas so they don't have to think about as much about structure. Great. And it allows students to participate and focus on the task and sentence frame strategies. Thank you, Jeffrey. Great, thanks all for sharing. Okay. All right, so thinking about more strategies for that sentence level production. So I'm going to give you some examples now, specifically of those receptive tasks versus the productive tasks. So again, we'll be starting with our receptive tasks. There we go. So here's an example of a receptive task you might do with students. This is a sentence and a fragment sort. Okay, so the students don't have to think about producing language here. They're just paying attention to the content, right? The objective is, what is a sentence and what is a fragment? And so they might do a sort here. So this is a receptive activity. Another example here is sentence, not a sentence. This is a receptive task. But what I like about this activity is the additional support of the color coding, right? So you see the parts of speech color coded. The subject and the predicate have their own colors, and I definitely encourage color coding with your students. You might have more capacity to do that in small groups, but love color coding, and even as a whole group with all of your students, if you can, decide on different colors for the different parts of speech. I think it's a great way, for students to immediately, recognize those different parts of speech like nouns and verbs and adverbs. I love that strategy and that tool. So this is a receptive task. Now, what's a productive task? So they've gotten some receptive activities under their belt, some at-bats, but now you want them to produce some language. We're farther into that content objective. So here, maybe you have students prepare the fragments. And so they're having to produce a little bit of language here. So this would be an example of a productive task. Okay, so how do I get my students to expand and to use more complex writing structures to add on to their details so you're not constantly asking, add more, tell me more. I love this strategy. It is, and I'm sure maybe some of you are familiar with Witsy or the Writing Revolution, because but so. And what it is, students take a short independent clause that you've provided that's content related, and they expand upon it using each of the three conjunctions. Now, it doesn't always have to be all three. If you're in the lower elementary space, maybe you're only teaching them because, And I also encourage you all, like, kinders can do this too. I've seen it done with ELL students. If you teach them the conjunctions and provide them the vocabulary, it can be done probably later in the year once they've learned more of that essential vocabulary. Hey, the younger the better to get started with working with language, right? And so using a variety of sentence expansion activities is really going to not only build literacy, but also those thinking skills too for our students. And of course, it's providing those multiple exposures to a variety of sentence structures. And this specific activity, I'm about to give you some more examples of it and what it looks like. It's not just isolated to English language arts. I recommend writing in math. I recommend writing in science. In all the other subjects, writing can be incorporated. And so I'll give you some examples of that and how to do this activity, specifically in math. But of course, before you move on to an expansion sentence activity like because, but, so, we want to make sure that we teach those conjunctions first and what's their purpose in a sentence. So because, of course, tells the why in a sentence. The but is that change of direction, and the so provides us that cause and effect piece. Okay, so promise a math example. So this might be like a do now activity or an exit ticket activity. Maybe it's a station activity, but you're learning about place value. And your simple sentence that you provide is each digit in the number above is similar. So that would be the sentence that you give to students. And then they add on. And so these are just possible answers that maybe you're looking for. You might get a variety of answers. So for example, they might say they are all 5. They have different values. Or so pay attention to the place value. So those are all possible answers that they might give. But this shows you that it can also be done in math. Writing can be incorporated in any block. So when we do an activity like because, but, so, and just to read the simple sentence that was given here was Galileo is considered to be the father of astronomy. And then they're adding on with because, but, or so. Add a visual, right? We want to access that prior knowledge, that content that you've already taught students. They're going to need that. So add a visual, but always be careful about the visuals that you use in your pieces, because sometimes visuals aren't actually that helpful to students. So for example, maybe you've talked about Galileo, but you haven't shown a lot of pictures of him and really who he is. And so students might not recognize that Galileo is the person in this picture necessarily, or it's not really giving them content, right? It's not accessing that knowledge about Galileo and what you've taught and about him being the father of astronomy and what that involves. So maybe you use these images instead, because that's going to start accessing really the content that you're looking for so that they can add on to those complex sentence structures. So these images shown with the telescope, that's going to access, oh, yes, the planets. And here's a picture of him even with the planets. So that's going to be a little bit more helpful of an image when we're trying to really jog that memory. So just being more intentional about the images that you do provide when you are trying to provide more access to content. All right, of course, we have our entering, our emerging ELLs. They're still really learning language, adding to that vocabulary bank. They're gonna need even more help. So a sentence expansion activity like because, but, so might not be necessarily completely accessible to them. So we need to further scaffold. So how can you do that? So simple sentence that was given here to students was Hitler and Stalin were alike. And then they're asked to add on with because, but, so. But here, maybe you start with a stem, and all you're asking for them is to add that phrase. Maybe it becomes a frame. And even more, as you get to the bottom here, maybe it's a closed sentence. So there's even more support there. And maybe you're just providing a word bank for students and you're just wanting them to just fill in that essential vocabulary. So that's another way to lighten that linguistic load there, even with this activity. See some folks in the chat. Okay, so I see some folks talking about handwriting. Yeah, handwriting is hard. If you can't read what a student's writing, right? For those students, obviously OT help is great. I used to send students home, with the traceable letter sheets. I myself had to do that as a young student because teachers couldn't read my handwriting. I mean, the more practice, the better. But yeah, that's tough when you can't read a student's writing. In this remote space, it's kind of been easier because students have been able to type, especially in the middle school and high school levels. So it's easy to read their writing in that space. But I hear you all, the lower elementary folks, when you can't read their writing. All right, and then of course you want to increase the rigor. And I had to add Miss Amanda Gorman here because I love her and I'm obsessed. But eventually what you want to be able to do with your students is to just give them these two things, the subject and the conjunction. And then as a productive task, they're creating that sentence themselves. Okay, and so that's really what you're working towards with a sentence expansion activity like because, but, so is eventually they're producing that language on their own. You've just given them the content subject and then the conjunction, go, right? So this is what we're working towards, increasing that rigor. All right, so it's always important, and I always stress that teachers need to do their own activities before they teach them. And so I want you all to try this. So your turn. So just pick one of these, 1, 2, or 3. You don't need to do all 3 conjunctions. We don't have time for that. Finish one of these sentences yourself using the because, but, so strategy. So the sentence activities learned today will support my MLLs and ELLs because I promise we're not done yet. I have more strategies to share, but just so far. And then again, don't press submit yet. I will give you our code word. Give you about 10 more seconds. I'm not going to press the timer because it's messing up my screen. All right, empower. Looks like folks are ready. Love it, because they make the work much more accessible. The sentence activities learned today will support my MLLs and ELLs. Oh. Love these, y'all. Great. Yes, and again, I really encourage you, if you're going to do this sentence expansion activity with your students, write in the answers that you would want your students to give you so that you know what to expect and what you expect of them. It's really, really important. Oh. All right, so paragraph writing. Let me fix my screen here because it's doing crazy things. There we go. All right, so I promised we would touch on paragraph level writing. Where do we see this on the nicest flat rubric? So we see this specifically in that coherence of response and degree of response space. Okay, so we're really working towards students having that clear development in their writing, that organization, that introduction, that middle piece, that expansion, and then that conclusion. That's really what we're working towards for students to demonstrate proficiency in that narrative and informational writing piece on that extended response. All right. So how do we get students there? And so this is really for any student that really struggles with paragraph writing. Starting with the single paragraph outline is always a really great way to help them organize their writing. So I like the scaffold. It really helps with the organization and planning piece. It provides students a really clear roadmap for paragraph writing, because that can be really scary. And then also as a even more of a scaffold and more support, especially for our entering and emerging students and our newcomers, you can pre-fill some of the parts of this out for them, right? So taking off a little bit more of that linguistic load and just having them fill in parts of it. Here's a couple more ideas for those at-bats, those receptive activities for students. So here, maybe you write it as a class, right? So you take an SPO, put it on the board, or in your remote classroom, you're on your Nearpod or Pear Deck or whatever it is that you're using, and you generate a paragraph together using an SPO. So it becomes a shared writing activity. Maybe it's a matching game. So you're giving students a collection of details. You have two different topic sentences, and then students are matching each of those details that go with that topic sentence. Okay, so then that's another idea. And then also reverse the process. So what that means is you have students literally deconstruct a paragraph into an SPO, into that single paragraph outline. And so this really helps students organize, work on that organization piece, and being that clear and coherent with their writing as well. And I have included on the Padlet a bunch of different types of single paragraph outlines. I even have up to, I think I put up to 4 paragraph outlines, and then I have book reports, examples, etc. for you all as well. All right, now this is really, really the important piece, right? This is, why we teach, because we want students to master these objectives. So how do we assess their writing and assess that they've mastered that objective, they've demonstrated proficiency? So you want to always begin with the end in mind. So maybe you create a rubric for your students to reference. That's super important. It gives students an idea of what they're working towards. What do I need to do in order to demonstrate proficiency? I really like student exemplars. So maybe you've asked a student from the year prior, can I keep this piece? It's amazing. I would love to share with my students next year what they're working towards. I used to love asking my students if I could save their pieces, and usually they're more than willing. Also, it could be teacher created as well. And then of course, the Nicest Flat writing rubric is a great progress monitoring tool, especially, I think Nicest Flat is happening this year, y'all. I'm sorry to say, but it's been a while since we've taken it, right? And we need that data. And so the Nicest Flat writing rubric is a really great tool. Every once in a while, maybe it's once a month at the end of a unit, you could compare that writing artifact with the writing rubric, score it. How is the student progressing towards demonstrating proficiency on the Nicest Flat? Also, you can maintain a folder or portfolio of student work, and you can track that progress over time with the Nicest Flat writing rubric, staple it to, and then you have a portfolio of work. And then also differentiation of product. Now, this is really important, and this is something that everyone should consider for multilingual learners is, maybe they have choice in how they're demonstrating proficiency in writing to you. Maybe instead right now for our entering students, instead of writing that 3-paragraph essay, maybe it's a closed 3-paragraph essay. You've pre-filled some of those parts out for them because they're just not there yet. Maybe instead of for our emerging or transitioning students, they're orally saying something to you right now instead of writing, and that's okay. They'll get there. Word banks too. I love word banks. Add that to support our L's as well. And this is something too you'd have to get with your leadership to talk about in terms of choice, because everyone has to be on board with this. But I definitely recommend differentiating a product. Maybe it's not on the summative assessment, but definitely as you're working towards. And of course, I really wanted to share I'm checking my time. Okay, so I'm going to just talk through this really, really quick. And I had already planned on talking through it quickly. The NLAP tool is such a great tool for ideas on differentiated product for students, but also it gives really great ideas for those receptive versus productive tasks. I've downloaded, it says grades 3 to 8. I think that's an error. I think I have K to 12 on the Padlet. I've shared this slide with other schools, so ignore that. I think I have K to 12 on the Padlet, and I'll make sure that I do by the end of the day if I don't. But the NLAP tool, if you're not familiar, it's aligned to the reading, writing, and speaking and listening Common Core standards. It addresses all 4 modalities across all 5 proficiency levels. And again, it really provides great ideas for differentiated product and activities to do with students that's connected to that content anchor standard. So I'm going to give you just a quick run through of what that looks like if you're not familiar with this tool. It's very meaty. I don't have a lot of time to digest or deep dive into it, but I've attached it to the Padlet for you to explore a little bit more. And I'll give you my contact information too at the end of this if you want me to deep dive into it with you. But just to go over it really quickly, here are the 5 levels: entering, emerging, transitioning, expanding, commanding. You get your anchor standard here, your Common Core standard, and then how it's broken down. Okay, and here you see the word receptive. It's giving you activities that a student can do to practice and have an at-bat with this standard at their proficiency level. I love this. And it goes into the swirl. Here are listening activities that connect to this writing standard. Here are reading activities that connect to this writing standard. Here are speaking activities that connect to that writing standard, and so on. And here I've circled writing, right? Because that's ultimately what we're working towards with this writing standard, is that productive task of producing language. And then finally, what I love about this tool is the Linguistic Demand section. It highlights the essential key vocabulary that connects to that standard for you. So you're not having to do that work as an instructor, right? We don't have a lot of time to lesson plan. So this tool is really great in identifying what's that key vocabulary that these students need to know in order to master the standard. And what's also really cool about it is you can build language objectives from this piece of the NLAP 2, which I always encourage, you know, what is the language objective for our multilingual learners, right? That focus of language development should always be there for them. And then we don't have time for exploration, and I didn't think we would because 45 minutes is not long, but you have the Padlet. I'll put it into the chat again. I've added the text that I suggested. I have the strategies and tools broken down by sentence level, paragraph level. I have articles. I have some other extra items, and I have the NLAP tool on there as well. And just before we leave, I always think it's important to like name, like, how am I gonna keep working on this? What's the next step in this work? So what is one strategy and tool today that resonated with you, and how can you implement this into an upcoming unit or plan? So go ahead and write that, your response in the chat. And I'm not even going to say empower this time because I know we're short on time. So just write, what's your next step? What's that strategy or tool that resonated with you today? I'll just say empower. I see sentence frames, folks like the NLAP tool, sentence expansion activity, receptive versus productive tasks. Yes, sentence frames, seeing a mixture. Great. Well, we don't have time for questions. I'm so sorry. I want to be respectful of time. But thank you so much. This is my contact information, and I'll type it into the chat too. Would love to talk to some of you all about more deeply about writing strategies. If you would love to work with our organization, I'll also share our I'll actually stop my share here so I can put that into the chat. This is just a website for the collaborative, if you're not familiar with us, and then my email address. If you ever want to email me, ask me questions, connect, please do. And I hope you all have a great afternoon.
Just want to thank everyone and remind them to fill out the evaluation. And the next feature presenter will be at 1 o'clock today. Thank you, Jennifer, for your workshop. It was very informative, and I can see that everybody really did enjoy it.
Good, I'm glad. You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.